Economists don't necessarily understand everything that's going on. So if you want to ask, why did inequality take off? The answer is, that's an interesting question. We have a bunch of stories. There's probably some truth in all of them. Some of it is probably technology. It's probably true that technology reduced the demand for regular laborers, increased the demand for people with lots of formal education, although even college graduates haven't done so well since about 2000. Another answer, a little bit, is globalization. Certainly some significant number of blue-collar jobs were lost to imports from China and that sort of thing. A lot of it, though, seems to be changes in institutions and social norms. Why do I say that it's cultural and not economic, or not purely the underlying economic story? We can, to some extent, measure the impacts of things like technology and trade. And they're not enough. They're not big enough to explain what we're seeing. Which says, well, it's got to be something else, and cultural and political shifts are a natural place to look. Part of it is timing. This big turn corresponds pretty closely to the election of Ronald Reagan, right? You can see that's happening. Partly it's history. We know that this Great Compression, that was clearly political. So if the great move towards equality was political, then it's a pretty good bet that the significant part of the movement back towards inequality is also political. Got to say, all of this is a little bit, we're doing a fair bit of hand waving, but sometimes if that's where things seem to point, you say, look, this looks to me like it's not, for once, it's not just supply and demand and the invisible hand, that there's something going on about social norms and politics. It used to be that when corporations were deciding on the CEO's paycheck, right? Who decides how much a CEO is paid? Well, there's a compensation committee. Who appoints the compensation committee? Actually, the CEO appoints the compensation committee. So you might say, well, of course, they're always going to vote gigantic paychecks for CEOs. In fact, they used to be inhibited about that. They used to say, well, we can't, it'll hurt worker morale if we pay this CEO too much money, and the union will protest. But these days, unions have been vastly reduced in influence. The notion that the norm that says that outlandish pay to the CEO while the workers are poorly paid kind of went away, and a lot of that probably comes back to politics. The decline of unions, a lot of that decline took place during the Reagan years because the Reagan administration had strongly anti-union policies, so on down the line. So it looks like there's a kind of a turning point politically, institutionally around 1980 that turns us into this highly unequal society, and it hasn't fully played out yet. It's among other things because all the people who made all that money have accumulated big fortunes, and a lot of those fortunes are now getting passed on to their kids. And so we're still marching towards oligarchy, if you like. I don't think that the level of inequality we had in America in 1970 was a serious problem, but I think the level of inequality we have now is. And why do we think it's a bad thing? And some of the reasons are, one of them is just dollars and cents. If the top 1% takes a big slice of the pie, there's less pie left over for everybody else, and that matters. And then there's something that's much more measurable and objective, which is we all now deplore just how polarized, how vicious and dysfunctional our politics have become. And that, it turns out, is very, very clearly associated with rising inequality. Political scientists have done some really informative work on measuring political polarization. So you can talk and you can read speeches and you can read the president's latest tweets or whatever, but you can also do some very systematic things. You can look at votes in Congress, measure how far apart the parties are. And used to be there was a lot of overlap. There were liberal Republicans, there were conservative Democrats. There really was a center, and the center did not hold. And that's measurable. You can actually take measures of political polarization. And if you look at McCarty, Poole, and Rosenthal's measure of party polarization, what you see is that on the eve of World War I, the parties were very far apart. We had a highly polarized Congress. In the post-war decades, you had much less. There really was a center. The parties had a lot of common ground. Senators could work together on stuff, even House members. You can look at some of the big legislation that was passed in the 60s. The creation of Medicare, for example, had overwhelming bipartisan support. And then we get to where we are now. Parties are in completely different spaces. And this kind of shape here, this U, well, we saw that before, right? That fall and rise of political polarization correlates almost perfectly with the fall and rise of income polarization. As we became an increasingly unequal society, we also became a society whose politics were more and more divided. Once you have a tremendous concentration of income and wealth in the hands of a few people, they're going to buy influence with some politicians. Some will take the other side. And so you end up with the parties pulling apart. And that's telling you how extreme inequality gives rise to extremely polarized, bitter politics, arguably to the point where sometimes it almost looks like the country becomes ungovernable. We can't get an agreement on funding the federal government for the next year, or every year now. That's a hair-raising moment of crisis, and that's telling us that inequality is having effects that go beyond just the fact that some people have more money than others. It's distorting the whole shape of our society. The thing about that society I grew up in, we have come to realize, is that it didn't just happen. I mean, we sort of thought that it was our birthright. This is what an advanced society looks like. It's a broad middle class. It turns out, actually, that was a society that was created by government policies. It was created by Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal and the things that he did in the 30s and 40s, and then things that, for a while, both parties subscribed to. Social Security, strong unions, a whole bunch of policies. And those policies were reversed starting in the 70s and helped to create this wildly unequal society we have now. I'm for policies to reduce inequality, to raise the level of the safety net, to compress the high inequality of wages. Now, why would I be for that? Part of the answer is I just think it's right. So economics is not a morality play, but economists do have morals, right? And I think we would be a morally better society if we were less unequal. And I'd also add that even if all you were concerned about is the rate of economic growth, which you shouldn't be. You should care. GDP is a useful measure, but in the end, economics is supposed to be about people. But even on raw GDP growth, there's now a lot of evidence that having policies that protect people from the worst is actually good for economic growth. We've talked before about natural experiments. It turns out we have some natural experiments from the unrolling of important social programs. Both food stamps and Medicaid were not instituted all at once all across America. They were actually, they're both federal state combined programs that were instituted in some places first and then gradually spread across the country, which means that we can actually compare what happened later in the lives of children who got food stamps, children who got Medicaid versus children who didn't. And guess what? children who got adequate health care, adequate nutrition, thanks to those programs, were a lot more productive as adults later in life. So it turns out that if you're going to have an economy that does well, one thing you can do is to make sure that everybody has access to the basics, and especially that children have access to the basics. So um, you may think, oh, this is just welfare. This is helping the poor. Well, actually, yeah, it is, but it's not just. You don't do it just out of the goodness of your heart, though you ought to do it for that reason too. It also turns out that if you want to have a society of productive people, you want to make sure that they've had enough to eat and that they've had good health care when they were young. If you're concerned about inequality, which I hope you are, if you think that we are too unequal and that, in particular, that people at the bottom are not getting enough, but people in the middle class as well, um, you should be you should be advocating on multiple fronts. You can't rely upon markets to deliver justice. Again, the economy is not a morality play. The market is not going to necessarily give us a socially acceptable outcome. So it has to be political intervention. We know that you could do tremendous amount with basic safety net programs. I mean, every advanced country except America has some form of universal guaranteed health care. That's actually, it's not hard. And it's not, they all actually spend less on healthcare than we do. So it's not as if the money is a big obstacle. We know that basic aid, nutritional aid works. A safety net that is significantly above ground level is something that we can do. It costs money. It requires that you collect enough money in taxes. So you can't keep on cutting taxes and at the same time do these things. We have these two terms now that we use a lot, redistribution and predistribution. So redistribution is collecting taxes, including on taxes on the rich, and using it to provide aid to people who are in need of help. And we do a fair bit of that in the United States, but other countries do more, and I think we should be doing more. But there's also predistribution, which is basically trying to raise the wages of ordinary workers before the government gets around to taxing and spending. And there's a fair bit you can do there. Minimum wages. Now, every economist, I think, would agree that if you set a completely unrealistic minimum wage, you're going to have problems. If we try to demand that companies pay everybody $30 an hour, this is going to not be a good thing. But we have a lot of evidence on the effects of changes in minimum wages in the United States near the relatively low levels that we have, and there is zero evidence that it costs jobs. So you can raise the wages of lower earning workers, at least some, by increasing the minimum wage. Unions we used to have a strong union movement in the United States. It negotiated good wages for its members and actually also had a kind of penumbra effect, an umbrella effect that kept wages high for blue-collar workers in general. Other countries still have powerful union movements. You look at some place like Denmark, and 2/3 of the workforce is unionized. If you care about inequality, you should be supporting policies that make it easier for workers to organize and make it harder for employers to bust their unions. Take all of those things together. Can we go back? Can we make America back to the kind of society it was in 1965? I don't know. No one really can tell. But could we substantially reduce inequality? Yeah, we could. And we know that because we can look at other countries. Denmark is every bit as open to the global economy as we are. It has the same technology we have. It has a much, much lower level of inequality. Not paradise, not utopia. Economists, almost by it's a necessary professional qualification that you not believe in utopia. But things can be better. Things can be more equal? Yeah, we could do that. Other countries have. We could do it too.